Well, it's hard to tell how close we might be to a new NAFTA deal. Negotiators are working feverishly in Washington, trying to close some of the gaps that remain between the two sides.
In a trade agreement, it's not like running a race where you can say which mile you are at. In a trade negotiation, nothing is done until everything is done.
Canada and the U.S. are trying to agree on text that could be submitted to the U.S. Congress by the end of the month in order to join the deal the Trump administration signed with Mexico. The two sides still have to resolve differences on three key issues: dairy, cultural protections, and the Chapter 19 dispute resolution mechanism. As White House economic advisor Larry Kudlow puts it, dairy might be the deal's biggest obstacle.
And I think the United States would rather have a trade deal with Canada, but it has to be a good deal, right? And the word that continues to block the deal is MILK.
Right.
Okay?
And joining us now from our downtown Toronto studio, former Foreign Affairs Minister Peter MacKay, now a partner at Baker McKenzie. Great to have you on the program, Peter. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure, Erin. Thank you.
So more talk of deadlines, this time by the end of the month, October 1st, actually. Now, the last deadline did pass with no real consequence to speak of. Are we looking at the same thing this time around, or is this different?
I think it's possible that we'll blow through this deadline as well, as we've seen in the past. As you mentioned, we've seen kind of artificial deadlines put in place, or red lines, that had political consequences. Whether it was the November elections in the United States, whether it was the presidential election happening in Mexico, these deadlines tend to be soft. And really what is important is getting these more contentious issues that you outlined dealt with, and a final deal inked. That's where everybody's attention has to be, not these artificial political deadlines.
You mentioned red lines, and as we've said, there are certain ones that the Trudeau government has said they will not give way on. Those are dairy, Chapter 19, that's the dispute resolution mechanism, and cultural protections. So on the other side, U.S. Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer has said he's not going to give on either of those two. So where does that put the two countries?
Well, two things I'd point out. Number one, I think that the Prime Minister has been sending some signals or trial balloons that the dairy and giving up some quota or some room in which we could take further quota from the United States has become a little squishy. So that, in fact, there may be some wiggle room there. The other is, I think on the bigger picture, what people have to be asking themselves is, these are things we're giving away. These are issues that we're being asked to compromise. What are we getting in return? There's been very little discussion about what the United States is willing to give up or give concessions on, or, in other words, give something at the table to compensate what we are giving up. And that appears to be lost on many who are following these negotiations.
Peter, I want to pick up on something you mentioned there on the dairy and possible concessions in terms of that. But we are going to an election in Quebec where the dairy industry really is a sacred cow. What does this do politically to the Prime Minister if he does give concessions on dairy?
Well, I think it has big ramifications, and it certainly could hurt the Premier, who is desperately seeking re-election and trailing, as you say, in Quebec. This is an issue that is on a lot of people's minds, but I would broaden it out. I think that across the country it has a big implication, symbolism as well, as I wouldn't put too fine a point on it, but it's a rural versus an urban issue. When one considers the lifestyle, but it's also about what Canadians pay for dairy products, for eggs, for chicken. In the bigger picture, it's back pocket issues that people do understand. What will it cost us versus what will it benefit us, I think is the way it has to be translated. And giving up a little bit and making a concession in one industry to save the entire NAFTA deal is the way I think this has to be framed if this, in fact, happens. Sure,
and you look at issues like the automotive industry and what they are facing if this does not go through. Chapter 19 is kind of a hard to understand chapter. Those of us who are in the industry, and yours as well, do know what this is as at stake. And Canada fought to have that in the first NAFTA. If that changes, is that a loss for Canada?
Well, I think it'll be perceived as a loss. Over the long term, it's hard to say because, you would have to replace the Chapter 19 dispute resolution mechanism with something else. What the Americans are proposing, as you know, Aaron, is to have their court system decide these disputes. Now, I would say to the Americans, be careful what you wish for, because in the case of the current administration, their courts have not exactly been good to them on a number of things, whether it was immigration reform, whether it has been a number of changes that they tried to make, the courts have blocked them. But the dispute resolution mechanism in place under Chapter 19 has participants from all three countries, and it's meant to be arm's length, impartial, and give everyone confidence that this is a neutral system, that it isn't weighted in one country's favor or the other. And that's why it is seen as a red line, and it was, as you mentioned, a critical piece of the original NAFTA, something that Prime Minister Mulroney, in fact, walked away from the table at one point and then was enticed back, and they were able to come to a conclusion on NAFTA.
Yeah, and the decisions made by that trilateral organization does mean Canada has been successful in the past because of this.
Extremely.
I want to talk about the economy, though. How badly does Canada's economy need some certainty as to what is actually going on?
Well, that's a very good point. I think the uncertainty has had a ripple effect. We've seen job numbers out this today that have been very disturbing, troubling. 51,000 jobs lost. We've seen the effect on the dollar. Direct foreign investment is one that's hard to calculate, but we know that that is in a bit of a free fall, as is capital leaving the country. Now, there are other factors, including this court decision that came down regarding the pipeline, that have also been a disincentive for investors. But it does put a chill on the Canadian economy. Anything that creates the impression that this could launch Canada into a very, very difficult place. I don't want to say the word recession, but this coupled with tariffs on aluminum and steel, tariffs on cars that have been threatened, and goodness knows our energy sector, if the Americans were ever to, God forbid, say, you know, we don't need Canada's energy anymore because we're becoming energy independent, those are the type of major muscle movements and shocks that could put Canada into recession territory.
Peter MacKay, Canada's former Foreign Affairs Minister, now partner with Baker McKenzie. Really great to have you on our program, and thanks for all your insight.
Thank you, Aaron.